It is a great honor for me to join this morning as a moderator in this side event of the 64th Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is currently being carried out in very challenging conditions. As we speak, the Committee of the Whole and some informal negotiations are taking place exclusively in a virtual format. The main subject of today's meeting is, therefore, of the utmost relevance and importance. It will be my pleasure, then, to give the floor firstly to the coordinator of the Civic Space Unit of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Brigitte Kainz-Labé. I understand that in her presentation, Ms. Kainz-Labé will elaborate on the guidance produced by the Office of the High Commissioner on civic space and COVID-19. Then, the Executive Director of the International Drug Policy Consortium and FORHEM will present key findings of the paper entitled Innovation and Resilience in Times of Crisis, Civil Society Advocacy for Drug Policy Reform under the COVID-19 Pandemic. From the Office of Drug Policy and Science of Health in Canada, Mr. Bobby Chauhan, I hope I pronounced correctly, if not, sorry, manager of the International Unit, will share efforts made in promoting and protecting civil society space at national and international level. While praising Canada for including civil society representatives in the delegations to the CND sessions and meetings, let me share that we also have, again this year, civil society representatives in our official delegation. I invite other countries to do equally. And finally, I will give also the floor to the Executive Director of Youth Organization on Drugs Action, Jan Stola, who will discuss how civil society space has shrunk in Hungary and other countries in the region, and what steps YODA has taken to push back on this trend. Without any more comments, I will then give the floor to Ms. Brigitte Kainz-Labé. You have the floor. Thank you.
So, good morning. So my name is Birgit Kainz-Labé. I coordinate the Civic Space Unit in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the UN office that looks after human rights. And I'd also like to greet everyone and thank everyone for being there and for having invited us to speak a little bit about this very, very critical issue. I don't think we can say it often enough, but the High Commissioner has said it, and also the Secretary General has said it. There has never been a moment when it was more important to really honor civic space and include civil society and make sure that the community is involved at all stages of decision making, because that's the only way we can really be sure that we take the decisions that we need to overcome the pandemic and also to then build back better, hopefully. And to, yeah, and I was asked to set a little bit the stage for this meeting by talking about what do we mean by civic space. The definition I'm using here is included in a UN guidance note that was issued last year on civic space. So this is a guidance note for the UN system to step up its approaches to civic space, and I will just use that framing to discuss a little bit what we are talking about, and then I'll say also a few words about civic space and COVID again. So very clearly, civic space is the environment. What we say is the place that allows people to shape their futures, to influence the lives of their own lives and the lives of the people in their society. And it's something that it's a universal desire to do so. It's not something that, you know, a state can decide, yes, you get that space or you don't get it. People want to contribute to their societies and shape their futures. And that's why, of course, the international human rights law has many provisions actually that relate to enabling that space. Yeah. So while states shape how exactly that works, it's not their decision to accord it or not. And I think that's very important. What are the freedoms that we are talking about? I think the rights, of course, one of the key rights that we sometimes forget when we talk about this is the right to participate. There is a right to participate in international human rights law, actually states job it is to facilitate that this can happen in a meaningful way at the different levels. But the right to participate is only working if you have the freedom to really speak your mind, and if you have access to the information that you need to take decisions, informed decisions. And of course also it implies that you can associate with others, mobilize others to share your views, and also assemble to show what your views are. So we have the right to participate, we have the freedoms of association, assembly, and very key expression, and of course several other rights that are associated with this, but I'm not going to speak about them now. And then what it means also is that you have to be able to do all of this in security, safely, and people will not criticize any measures if they are at risk of being detained as a result. So the security aspect cannot be underestimated. As I said at the beginning, the last point here is restrictions on this space must comply with human rights law. And there are several ways to assess whether these restrictions are necessary and proportionate. Can we go to the next slide, please? So you see, this is a bit of it doesn't look very professional, this slide, but it really kind of shows how free civic space relates to outcomes, to COVID-related outcomes. You need those three things that I just discussed. To hear the variety of voices, to discuss the different options that actually respond to your exact needs, and to hear also candid feedback on whether policy measures work or don't work. And if you have all of this, you will get better responses, and of course much stronger buy-in by communities, which means in turn more trust. Can we go to the next slide? And of course, trust is a key ingredient to overcome all the COVID consequences. Yeah. So this is just a bit of a recap, but now mirroring what is in the UN guidance note. We call them the 3 Ps for better civic space. The key one is, how do you ensure participation? In our case, this was about what the UN needs to do more on civic space. So really ensure safe participation. And of course, in the COVID context, we have seen challenges when all the communication moved online, in terms of including civil society. How do you organize negotiations? How do you ensure that there is transparency? How can we have really equal access to information? There were also positive sides, I think, to having moved online, in terms of being able to reach more people, but we've also heard from many parts of the UN that civil society faced challenges in terms of really being able to have a seat at the table as they had previously. And what we've been saying from a human rights point of view, COVID should never be used as a pretext to make participation harder or restricted in any way. And then, as I've said, we have those other 2 pieces. So this, for us, this means that the UN has a role. It really at all levels, also at the country level, make sure that that we through our programming we invest in better, more inclusive, effective participation. And then, of course, also protect the security and protect the freedoms that you need for effective participation. And the last point is the question about security. So can we go to the next slide just to say a few words? This is just a screenshot of the guidance that we issued on civic space and COVID-19. And it makes some key points which are on the next slide, and I will just say a few words about each of them. So what are the key points from this guidance? I'm not a believer in long novels about things, so it's a very short guidance, and those are the points it makes. You can see, of course, as I said at the beginning, more than ever, we have to encourage participation in the COVID-19 response and be creative about how we enable this, and be very creative in making sure it really reaches the communities. One of the very interesting things that happened when we were in our work with the UN is WHO did several discussions about, how do you work on this information? How do you build the trust? And really, all these people who worked on...
If you can start wrapping up.
Yes, okay, sorry. One of the points they really made very consistently is only two-way real dialogue will build the trust that we need to combat a pandemic. I've already talked about the importance of really access to information and reliable information and transparency in that space, so that we know what do we not see also. Freedom of expression, I think, is a point I've made. Protecting civil society, the problem is that all the protection issues have remained, transformed partly themselves, but remain on the agenda, and we must continue to fight for them. And I think the freedom of assembly is obvious. Freedom of assembly remains a freedom even in COVID context. So again, we need creativity to make sure we can uphold it. And then the last one is manage impact on privacy, because of course COVID was also used as a pretext to track people's movements and to surveil certain things, and has been used in some places to restrict the work of human rights defenders and civil society actors more broadly. Yeah, so that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Birgit. Now I'm very happy to give the floor to Anne Forjan. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you in particular for agreeing to moderate this event, and also particular thanks to Mexico, Canada, Switzerland, and Australia for continued and strong commitment to civil society participation. I'd also like to thank all of our co-organizers and panelists for being with us here today. So we have all been affected by COVID and its restrictions to a lesser or greater degree. Many of us have been very fortunate to be able to work from home, and this in itself is a huge privilege. COVID has starkly laid bare so many inequalities in society, and the economic and social impacts of these restrictions will be felt for years to come. So my task here today is to present the key findings and recommendations from a report that we at IDPC published just last month on how COVID restrictions have impacted the advocacy activities and working methods of civil society. And from the outset, I want to thank Dania Putri, who led on this research for IDPC and on the writing of this report. When the pandemic hit, we felt we felt it was important as a civil society network to capture the impact of the restrictions around movement, in particular, and how these restrictions were impacting our collective advocacy work and changing the dynamics between civil society and policymakers, and really to try and see what the lessons learned were and how we could share these lessons learned across the civil society network, and think about different and innovative ways of responding to the situation. We interviewed more than 30 people from civil society, policymakers and donor organizations. And in parallel, we ran a survey that was completed by more than 40 colleagues from the IDPC membership. In the research, we really tried to focus on the impact on advocacy processes and civil society access to debates and to policymakers. Some of the examples in the case studies that are cited in the report, and of course I encourage you all to read it, are thematically specific, but of course the overall focus was on the how of advocacy rather than the what, for example, the substance. But of course, overwhelmingly, colleagues who were interviewed work in drug policy and in harm reduction. The upshot is that COVID-19 has not prevented civil society from conducting advocacy and impactful advocacy, but there's definitely been an impact in how we work. And this has required creativity and innovation, and also an increased reliance on technology. And in some ways, and I'll talk about that a bit later, the restrictions have also reduced or blurred some of the traditional barriers to participation. So going to my next slide, the direct impacts on movement restrictions on the regular modes of advocacy. At the local and the national level, in many places around the world, in-person work has been able to continue in a limited way. And we've seen this in particular around the provision of harm reduction services and in some forms of advocacy towards governments. We've illustrated our report this time, so I'll share with you some of the illustrations. But in some places, and this is from the case study from Kenya, people were not able to meet in one large group, so they would organize multiple but smaller meetings on the same subject to comply with restrictions on gathering size, and were still able to meet. Obviously, there's been very severe restrictions of movement for civil society working in outreach and service delivery, on data collection, for legal aid provision, but organizations have been able to adapt quickly. And one example from Mauritius, where a civil society organization basically quickly at the beginning of the pandemic gained a permit to be able to move around. And this was actually also because they had quite strong and pre-existing relationships with the government. And what we've also learned through the research is that pre-existing relationships with government really determine the extent to which organizations can continue or expand their advocacy work under these restrictions. One problem has been that there's been less opportunity to cultivate new relationships. And we see this week, for example, at the CND, where normally civil society organizations, representatives attending would have been able to approach new representatives from government, ask them for a side chat, a coffee, and that's much more difficult now to do online. So I think another issue is that, and this was alluded to in the previous presentation, is that policymaking has become less transparent and less easy to monitor. And this has been very worrying for civil society around the concerns of decisions and negotiations made behind closed doors to which we are not able to contribute. There has been significant disruption, this is my next point, to community and civil society organizing. But there have been ways that have been found around this to continue, to organize online. Specifically, before COVID, we had physical gatherings, and this is this illustration where the work and organizing happened. post the pandemic beginning, there's been much greater reliance on online organizing and the use of WhatsApp groups and mobile apps for exchange of information and requests. I think it's also important to say that there's been some amazing work of community and peer-led organizations. This was also picked up in our research, working together to support, either the transfer of funds for the communities who are most affected, for food, for support for telecommunications access, which has become so important under this pandemic, and also for basic hygiene supplies. So moving on to my next slide. We tried to illustrate here, how we would meet before in person, and this is like a UN event, and now how we're all online, like this event, and the very serious risk of Zoom fatigue. It's quite interesting though, because I think, although there are many disadvantages that we feel these restrictions have brought on us, this illustration was also inspired by one of our respondents who said, being in a Zoom breakout room with policymakers in some ways can feel more intimate than being in a massive UN building, because you have people, this close to you, although it's through a screen. But at the same time, as I said before, many side conversations are lost in these virtual spaces. Some respondents in our research really viewed the restrictions as a kind of equalizer. For example, people who cannot travel easily to places like Vienna or New York can more readily participate in international meetings. And also, to some extent, policymakers and government officials are more reachable because everybody has been at home. So there's pros and cons. But I think, the real question remains around the methodology for online events, especially accessibility for those with less online access or lacking the right devices. These technological barriers are very real and will privilege people with resources. And that's something we have to take into account. We're still exploring hybrid events, again, like this CND. And I think it'll be interesting to reflect back on how this week has gone. In theory, online events should allow for greater participation, without the need for travel costs or lengthy and painful visa processes. And we need to be sure as civil society and vigilant that COVID-19 does not become a way for civil society space to become increasingly limited when there's so much opportunity for the space to be expanded. And I think we all need to be aware of webinar fatigue. And the other issue, I think, as well, is with all these online meetings, it's been more difficult, I think, for people to speak frankly, because you can be concerned about being recorded. What are the privacy considerations? So there's some concerns around self-censorship. The next slide, just to say that,
Anne, if you could start wrapping up. Thank you.
I just need one more minute. Thank you. I think the strength of existing networks has been important for how civil society has operated under COVID. And this network and interdependence and multi-level collaboration really has, the interconnectedness that civil society has had before COVID has really helped them to remain connected and leverage each other in this process. I think there's some big questions about the future, about large international gatherings, about frequent air travel, about unequal access to resources, about who is privileged and who has access. And I think these are very critical questions. If I could just highlight a few recommendations in closing, and this came out of our research. For civil society, we need to continue to use the advocacy innovations that COVID has brought us, such as the adoption of virtual events, to ensure meaningful participation, but also to keep reaching out to the grassroots communities and affected communities, ensure they're involved. For policymakers, I think policymakers need to establish and follow well-embedded structures for regular engagement with civil society and communities. Think about people you're not regularly seeing now, there's not in-person events, and make sure you are connected to them. And my final recommendation for donor organizations is to really support and facilitate funding for communities and civil society who are rapidly responding to the COVID pandemic and the ongoing shifts in context, needs and environments, allowing them to easily reprogram funds that might not have been used for travel, but for online organizing. I will leave it there, but thank you so much for this opportunity to share our latest report on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this very insightful presentation and the importance of the message of how civil society must have space and the opportunities to participate. I will have the chance to give the floor to Bobby Chauhan. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you again for inviting the Government of Canada to provide some remarks for this side event. I don't have any sort of slide presentation, especially something as nice and illustrative as Anne did in her previous one. I really enjoyed looking at some of those illustrations. It's really nice to see. I do have a few points that I'll be happy to share with you. And again, the focus of my discussion will be to discuss really efforts made by the Government of Canada in promoting and protecting civil society space. And I'll be particularly talking about the inclusion of civil society representatives on the Canadian delegation in relation to the C&D sessions and meetings. I think a good way to kind of start, and we're of course focusing on the impact of COVID-19, but I think a good way to start would be to provide a little bit of an overview in terms of the Government of Canada's and CSO engagement, and how that engagement that we've already had established helped us during this kind of COVID time that we're dealing with. So, of course, Government of Canada sees the value in engaging with civil society representatives throughout the year, as civil society provides a unique perspective and expertise in terms of our drug policy work, both nationally as well as our international sorts of experiences and engagement opportunities. What we did recognize, and this is back in 2017, late 2017, as well as early 2018, that we were having more frequent engagement with Canadian civil society organizations on international drug policy issues. There was a lot of interest to ensure that Canadian civil society was engaged in terms of what the Government of Canada was doing internationally. And based on these experiences, both civil society and Government of Canada officials, and specifically led by Health Canada, which is the organization that I'm in, agreed to formalize ongoing opportunities for discussion on international drug policy issues. So this kind of formal sort of engagement process that was established in January of 2018 allowed for a few things. It allowed for more scheduled engagement throughout the year with civil society to discuss international drug policy issues. It helped to ensure increased participation of civil society organizations on key policy issues in advance of and during international meetings. And I think that's one of the key things, is like the in advance of component to the preparations, for example, in advance of C&D. Generally speaking, we engage with civil society in terms of our preparations. I'd say it would be in September or October is when we start having meetings, and then we continue having meetings with civil society almost on a monthly basis up until C&D itself. And also this formalization back in 2018 allowed us to have 4 civil society representatives, including 2 representatives with lived and living experience that were nominated through a self-selection process to be part of the Canadian delegation. So that was the Canadian delegation that joined C&D in March of 2018. One thing I did want to mention is in terms of whether it'd be civil society representatives or any sort of non-federal government representatives that were part or are part of the Canadian delegation, that they have signed an agreement outlining the responsibilities as members of the Canadian delegation, as well as the agreement outlines some confidentiality obligations, and just to ensure that they speak on behalf of the Government of Canada's position. And I think that's one of the things that we have to recognize, that there is a little bit of a balance of when a civil society or any sort of non-federal government representative joins a delegation formally, that those representatives then have to speak on behalf of that government. So following the positive experience of 2018 at C&D, we decided to expand civil society representation to 6 representatives in 2019, and that's where we are right now in 2021 as well. So this still included 2 individuals with lived and living experience, and again, they're always nominated through a self-selection process. And then we also included 2 youth representatives who were selected to attend the annual CND Youth Forum and participate at CND as part of the Canadian delegation. So as of today, so since 2019, we have 8 civil society representatives on our Canadian delegation as a whole. And that on average represents about 25% of our delegation in terms of size, which is great to see. The 2 youth representatives that we did also select were selected in collaboration with civil society. So we have a little bit of a common application, screening, and interview process. And then in the end, the government of Canada selects 1 individual youth representative, and then our civil society representatives would select the other youth individual. The formalized process in 2019, when we expanded it, also included a CSO or civil society liaison who would be the main point of contact between civil society and the government in Canada. We were finding back in 2018, when we first included civil society as part of the Canadian delegation, that there was a lot more coordination that was needed. So it was a little bit of a learning curve in 2018. And how can we kind of ensure stronger communication during CND and in advance of CND to make sure that civil society remained updated and engaged. So the idea was to bring forward a civil society liaison that would be able to be that main point of contact between both Government of Canada and civil society. And I'd like to just thank the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction for taking on that role for the past 2 years. As well as noting that Canadian Centre for Substance Use and Addiction provided financial support since 2018 to support our Canadian Civil Society delegation members for the in-person attendance at CND. I know it's a little bit different this year, as we're all kind of engaging virtually. Another thing to note for the 2019 and 2020 CND engagement is that it also allowed us to expand engagement for attendance of civil society at certain bilateral meetings. Of course, this is in agreement with other countries and the sensitivity of the discussions that were taking place. And it also provided us an opportunity as Canada to host an exhibition booth and do that in collaboration with civil society. So then both the Government of Canada as well as our Canadian civil society organizations were able to promote certain common drug policy priorities. And the big ones for 2019 and 2020, when we did host our booth, was the focus on stigma. And I think for both years, those exhibition booths were quite successful. It's unfortunate that this year, again, we're attending virtually, or else we would have also done something similar for 2021. And I'm sure it's going to be one of our priorities in 2022 when we're back in person. Another thing I wanted to mention was that successful engagement between the Government of Canada and civil society organizations is also dependent on having a discussion following each CND to see what worked and what can be improved. And I think that's something that we've been trying to do since 2018, is where following our CND meetings, we would have a discussion with our civil society organizations, asking them how we can strengthen their engagement, or how we can strengthen our communication. And that was reflected in 2019, where we said, okay, well, let's see how we can ensure your civil society engagement in bilateral meetings. I think also since 2019, I believe, we also were able to increase civil society engagement during informal negotiations. So it was back in 2019, as well as definitely 2020, as well as this year, where we have civil society as part of what we did is we established resolution teams for each resolution. So therefore, you would have one Government of Canada lead for each resolution.
Sorry for interrupting. Could you start wrapping up, please?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, and we would have resolution leads for Government of Canada lead for each resolution, and then we have a support team which is comprised of Government of Canada and civil society organizations. So all that to say that, you know, we already have established quite a good engagement with civil society organizations prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this strong foundation helped us kind of continue, I guess, the momentum during the pandemic. So we were able to still continue to have frequent meetings with civil society over 2020 to ensure that they were still engaged on some of the key drug policy issues, specifically looking at the ECDD cannabis recommendations and ensuring that civil society was engaged throughout those recommendations. There was a little bit of a learning curve on our end, as well as I think on a few organizations end, in terms of how we can ensure engagement during virtual engagement during the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think we were able to make adjustments. I think the one other thing that I want to mention is that with the COVID-19 pandemic, we had to also adjust our timing for engagement. So especially for C&D this year, we had to have earlier engagement. We as the Canadian delegations were engaged earlier in terms of the pre-session informals, as well as we had to engage earlier with our civil society organizations to ensure that we received their input related to our own L3 resolution, as well as our national statements. And I think that one of the key things that kind of helped with this engagement was just communication under a virtual setting to ensure that everyone was aware of what was going on. We continue to use, for example, WhatsApp groups this week, as well as previous years, just to ensure that everyone maintained engagement. And if there were any quick questions to Government of Canada representatives, that we were able to respond to those questions. I think there were also opportunities related to to this whole sort of COVID-19 sort of situation and the virtual environment that we're in. One of the advantages I think that we got from this is that we were able to increase engagement at meetings, both ourselves as Government of Canada, as well as civil society representatives to attend certain meetings. And for example, I think a perfect example is the ECD topical sessions, as well as the fall intersessionals in December.
Bobby, could you finish, please?
Yeah, sir, sorry. Just one more thing to mention is that I think one of the other advantages is the fact that, you know, having video-based meetings allow for better engagement than the traditional sort of phone-based discussions that we used to have in the past. So I think that's a sort of a best practice that we'd like to take forward, because it's a better way to kind of just maintain that engagement with civil society throughout the year. So apologies again for going over time. It's just there were a few points I wanted to share, and again, thank you once again for letting me share our perspective.
Thank you very much, Bobby. I would now give the floor to Jan Stoller. You have the floor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, for the moderation of this event, and to all the other speakers. And also big thank you to my predecessor from the Canada Health for such a strong inclusion of the civil society in your UN delegation, especially the youth. We have seen this in the previous CNDs, the civil society representatives that you have brought along with you, and I really believe this is an example to other governments. I really hope they will use as example. And this inclusion of the youth that you mentioned is especially important for me as the representative of the Youth Organizations for Drug Action, which is a network of young professionals and youth organizations who are working with their peers across Europe, the region that I will focus more on, as I think Anne Fordham of IDPC did a really good job on presenting the current civil society situation globally. I will probably focus more on the Europe, especially Central Eastern Europe and Poland, where I live, where I'm based. I think we haven't really had any attempts at deliberately limiting the civil society space in the field of drugs where the COVID was used as an excuse. Obviously, we faced plenty of difficulties because of the pandemic situation, but also, just as Anne mentioned as well, there were some positives coming from it as well. Can I ask for the first, or actually second slide, Marie? Yeah, so as you all know, I guess it all began in spring 2020, and the first hit of the pandemic for us as the service provided was usually the unexpected closure of the services that we provide, whether it's needle syringe exchange or the OST treatment or outreach service for the homeless people. Basically, in the chaos that was created in the beginning of the pandemic, it happened quite a lot that we were overseen. Basically, regulators, government officials just forget about us when they were imposing blanket lockdowns or blanket curfews, whatever you call it. And this was especially difficult for the people who live in the street, because they were not only left without some of the essential services, but their living situation was also really affected by the lockdowns in other way. And in plenty of situations, they basically lost their sources of income that they were making on the street. So seeing these needs, the service providers started to look for new ways of providing their services, the support for their clients. And may I ask for the next slide, Marie? Yeah, so quick adjustments were key to this. How can we replace the services that we have been providing so far? How can we continue our work in the new circumstances with first the danger coming from the pandemic itself, and then the government regulations that prohibited certain actions. Let's imagine you're running a needle and syringe program where people come in, a drop-in center, in other words, and then you basically cannot let anybody in. Do you move your staff into the streets? But then if you do this to distribute the needle and syringes on the streets, but then if you do this, how do you protect them from the virus, etc., etc.? That was the virus itself was one of the barriers and one of the risks. But then also each of the activities that we are conducting, they are funded by some donors. Either these are private or public donors, international organizations such as the EU or European Commission, and also these are based on the agreements with donors, which had to be adjusted to the situation. And that's where the discussion started between us and the donors. And I'm really happy to say that in the vast majority of the cases, the donors were very flexible and very much open to all the COVID-related adjustments on pretty much all the levels that you see, either it was local, national, or international. For example, we are currently implementing at Yoda. We are implementing a project funded by the European Commission, and on this is very much related to the advocacy function of the civil society, where we are preparing the civil society's input into the new EU drug strategy, and the plan was to host a meeting of the civil society representatives with the European Commission's representatives in Warsaw, where we are based. And it was supposed to happen in spring 2020, and obviously we had to delay it first to the autumn 2020, then spring 2021, and now we have to delay it once again to autumn 2021. And I really hope this can happen in the autumn. But at each time, really, I have to say that the European Commission was very, very understanding of the situation, and no formal problems were being made. The deadlines were being extended, and so on and so on. Next slide, please, Marie. Yeah, and I wanted to share one specific case study from Poland. Yoda, my network we are mostly focused on the transnational projects, but we do have partner and member organizations all around Europe. And I think there is notable positive example coming from one of our partners here in Poland, for the Foundation for Social Education, that was operating several HIV and hepatitis C testing facilities around Warsaw. And all these facilities were shut down about a year ago, in April 2020, where the first lockdown was imposed. They basically, in the chaos that happened back then, somebody forgot about them as of the essential services, and it took quite a long to fix that mistake. But they were in the situation, so now what they had to do to keep providing services during the pandemic was to find alternative solution. And the idea was somebody came with the idea to start individual testing using self-test kits that distributed, basically clients filling the form online, then having a call with the consultant, and then the Foundation for Social Education, they shipped the tests to their homes so they can use it in in their privacy in the home environment. Important thing to note is that this self tests were not really that much welcome before, because some of the professionals and some of the government officials, they were fearing that HIV tests should be conducted by the professionals in the controlled environment. The people may be in some sort of mental health crisis if they found out that they're HIV positive. But this really worked very well. And there was quite a bit of advocacy involved, but again, the donors were really open for this, and the local partners managed to both direct some of the local funding that was made for other services that they were not able to provide because of the pandemic. For example, the drop-in work or the stationary HIV testing. The donors allowed to move these funds to the remote, so to say, testing. Next slide, please. So I think the lesson is that there were certain opportunities and barriers, and the opportunities, as mentioned, were what I was feeling among the donors and all the partners from other fields was that there was this basically sense of greater good. We're in this difficult situation all together as a society, either local society on the national level or the global society, and because the situation is extraordinary, then we will have to move beyond certain red tapes that we had so far, and this resulted in more flexibility in some cases, in some reasons even additional funding, because we did receive some additional funding. But I also looking at the clients that we have, the people who are clients who are using our services, the service of our members and partners. I believe that generally people started to take health in general more seriously, and plenty of people decided to check, not only for COVID, but also to start to think about health in wider perspective. The barriers, as mentioned in the beginning, basically key barrier, I think, was the chaos and the rapid pace at which the situation was changing. And then you need, especially with the funding that takes a lot to allocate, it takes some time. But at the end, I think after some time this worked out, and even the stiff rules were bended in some ways. The last slide, please. So thank you for the attention, and to sum up, as seen is these two examples, the one of the EU drug strategy meeting and the local HIV home testing in Poland. I think there are also positives to take and the positive lessons to learn from this situation that we are in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan, for this presentation. And sorry, I have a problem with the camera, but I'm here. I hope that you're listening to me. If that's the case, I want really to thank all the presenters for their contributions. And before giving the floor for questions and answers, I only want to highlight what Jamie Bridge of the Vienna NGO committee said during the opening. Civil society continues to play a vital role in implementations, evidence building, policy design and evaluation, advocacy, the promotion of public health, mental health, and human rights, and in linking the work on the ground with the discussions here in Vienna. So it's extremely important the work civil society do, and the importance of keeping the space and the resilience of them for their contribution. So now I will open the floor for questions and answers. And please, I invite participants to indicate in the chat if they would like to take the floor. I will start by giving the floor to Amanda well, very difficult family name, from Switzerland. You have the floor.
Thank you, thank you. I agree, my surname is quite complicated. It's from Poland though. I would like to thank the organizers for this timely side event and the speakers for the valuable insight. It was really interesting to listen to your presentations. Last year, CND was the first multilateral meeting here in Vienna impacted by the changes of the COVID-19 pandemic. Since then, our lives have changed in ways that we couldn't have imagined. Here at the UN, we have seen many changes that now allow us to hold this year's CND as a hybrid meeting. With participation from capitals. As we have heard, this poses new challenges not only for member states, but for civil society in its advocacy work. However, the impacts of civil society advocacy work go beyond the work at the UN, and it was encouraging to hear all the different ways in which speakers have found ways to creatively respond to these challenges. As mentioned in our national statement during the general debate, we welcome that the new UNODC strategy recognizes the importance of including civil society in drug policy discussions in a meaningful way. And we look forward to see the results of the implementation of this strategy. Thank you all once again, and please stay healthy.
Thank you very much. I see also a question here in the chat that is related to the participation through virtual means. And it says, how can it be we can reach marginalized areas, as the case for us in Africa, Zimbabwe, to be specific, with areas where network connection is still a challenge. And we feel that the people have been left behind, and it has been worsened by the effects of COVID-19 pandemic. Do any one of the panelists would like to take that question?
I mean, it's a difficult question. I'm not sure that we can, really resolve some of these issues where people are remote and network coverage is really poor when we're depending on online communications to the extent that we are. But I think it's something that we need to really pay attention to and understand who is being excluded by certain means of communication. For IDPC, for example, we have been acutely aware that, it's not, of course, online access is an issue, but also that some people don't have the means to pay for data coverage or for online access to join a meeting, even if they do have a phone and are able to join. So, we've been trying to mitigate that by giving financial support specifically for people to be able to join virtually, to pay for their data coverage and to pay for their access. And in some cases to help them access a device if they haven't been able to have one. And I think this is also something that donors need to be acutely aware of, where before they had to pay for travel costs perhaps, but now they might have to pay for internet access and tablets and computers for people to be able to engage meaningfully.
Yes, and just maybe to add again from a human rights perspective, the discrimination patterns we see in terms of access to the internet very much mirrors what has been there before. And there are attempts happening, in terms of really thinking about this a bit more critically and exploring whether, some of this accessibility and leave no one behind questions can be injected in development policies and so on. Clearly, it is. I think it. It's something we need to pay a lot of attention to, because in the future, even more than so far, being excluded from the internet will mean being excluded from a lot of human rights.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank very much for the comments that have been presented during this panel. I think that the important messages of encouraging participation, maximize access to information, respect freedom of expression, protect civil society, uphold freedom of assembly, manage on how we deal with the privacy of people, and also the use of these technological tools the importance for policymakers to reach out to people that are not being able to engage right now, to support and facilitate funding for communities just now, precisely with the question that we had, is extremely important. So I also thank very, very much for the experience of Canada in how they managed to include civil society and the importance for the participation as government in different meetings, and in this case in the CND, and also Jan Stola for the presentation of the experiences that they have had and how they are trying to respond. So let me see if there's any further questions. Well, I don't see any further question, but I think that it's very important to see in the chat that there has been a lot of suggestion of very important documents that have been done by different organizations and the civil society. So I think that this would be extremely important for those that are following up this panel, this side event, to reach out to these documents, because this will give further information on the presentations of some of the panelists now, as well as other very important documents that refer to our theme. So I don't know if there's any further comments by the panelists before closing. If that's not the case, I thank you very, very much for accompanying us in this morning event, and particularly IDPC for the organization of the panel. And sorry for these technical problems that we had, that we were left out a couple of minutes from the event, but well, we are back, and still, if not with image, at least with voice. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a very successful participation in the CND. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.